Welcome to another episode of the Classical Republican. Today we are going to promote the repeal of the 17th Amendment, which is the return of the election of U.S. senators to the state legislatures. This may be a very heavy lift as it is very unpopular, but I will use my best classical Republican arguments to help with, and to help with the lift here today is Vince Eisinger. He is he is previously practiced as a commercial litigator with 2 law firms in New York. In addition to clerking for Judge Newman, Vince clerked for the Honorable Richard M. Berman of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Vince earned his Juris Doctorate cum laude from New York University School of Law, where he served as an articles editor for the New York University Law Review. He graduated summa cum laude from Brigham Young University, Provo, with a Bachelor of Science in Management. When he isn't spending time with his wife and 4 kids, Vince's personal interests include football, basketball, and weightlifting. All right, Vince, thank you for joining me today.
Sure, glad to do it.
Back in 2015, Vince wrote an article for the Toro College Law Review, the Toro Law Review. It's called Auxiliary Protections, Why the Founders Bicameral Congress Depended on Senators Elected by State Legislatures. So you talk about, in that article, you talk about how the founders wanted 2 distinct houses, and it wasn't just that we had 2 houses, that it was that they were distinct from one another. So you have the House, which is elected directly by the people, and they are supposed to be representing the people. And back then, the districts were much less populous, and so it was easier for members to understand the will of their district, and that's what they were supposed to represent. And so they were kind of like in the differentiation between the different types of representatives. You have delegate and trustee. They were supposed to be more of the delegate, representing the direct will of their districts. Now the Senate was supposed to be an indirect election, and that was to temper the volatility of the people. This was to help, also to help secure the liberties of everybody. And it also made it difficult it was supposed to make it difficult to lobby the Senate. There's also the federalism argument, and that's where states have a role in protecting their interests in the federal government. And states could also check the federal government with this idea. So that's what I have for your arguments, in that, and they're good, classically Republican. Again, classical Republicanism really emphasizes checks and balances, the mixed regime, and those are things that we should try to keep. All right, so do you have did I explain that well enough? Do you have anything to clarify on that?
No, I think that captures it well. I will mention that, as the title alludes to, as I approached this topic years ago, it was published in 2015. I actually wrote it even earlier. I was coming from the point of view of trying to remind us of what the framers were thinking of as they debated and drafted the document that they ultimately took to the states to have ratified. And so I think it helps us to go back to those original arguments as we think about, whether this is an amendment that's worthy of repeal or not. What were the arguments in favor of designing it differently first? And so that I just think that historical perspective helps. I also have a personal bias towards the judgment of a lot of those men that participated in those debates. at the time especially, I spent a lot of time researching the notes from that convention. I was studying the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, and the amount of time that and thought that went into the debates they were having, I respect greatly, and I think we deserve to accord them a great deal of deference. I'm not so sure that those who were um, proposing the 17th Amendment at the time gave the founders their due. So yeah, I'll just add that, I guess.
Okay. Do you think, you know what, I teach American government in my local college here, and you know, there's the idea how federalism changed from you know, early on it was more of a layer cake federalism. You had the federal government, and then you had the states, and they kind of stayed in their lanes. And then after the New Deal, you had more of a marble cake. It was all kind of mixed. And do you think that could occur without the 17th Amendment? Would that have been possible, or would we have stayed with our layer cake model of federalism?
Well, since you put the question as sort of a binary either or, I suppose I'd have to say I think it could still happen. For me, it's probably more a matter of degree. And I think the 17th Amendment was just one step in the road towards a marbleization, to use the term you describe. But I think without a doubt, in that prior world where senators were more directly accountable to state legislatures and to these state interests, that just, I mean, structurally creates a situation where interests are clashing, and it's more possible to separate those federal and state interests and to keep it sort of as a layer cake, as you put it. One thing I will mention, among the counter arguments, I think, to these arguments that you and I seem to subscribe to, there is a book I will mention that I think is very well written, and it's a very powerful argument, a counter argument, as I say. It's by a man named Michael Grava, called The Upside Down Constitution. It's an interesting read. I recommend it to anyone who's interested in political theory. I read it a long time ago, and I remember spending a lot of time on each page. He's very intelligent. It was a very dense read. But his general theory is that somewhere along the way, states themselves became fans of the federal government taking on more and more of a role in public life, because we as people, or at least as liberty-loving people, we like the idea of states having to compete for us, right? Creating environments where we want to live, lower taxes. I mean, in general, we're drawn to those kind of areas. I think we're seeing that now with, you know, states like California and New York losing so many of their people. People are fleeing to places where they're more free. State governments hate that, and hate that they have to compete that way. And the federal government can be a way to diminish the need for that kind of competition. If New York can't get away with taxing people highly because they'll just run to Florida where there's no income tax, a way around that is to have some sort of national tax that people can't escape no matter where they move to. And then if some of that money is rerouted back to the state governments, is as if they impose the tax themselves in the first place. So they can benefit from that national tax without having to impose it, and not having to compete with states like Florida that prefer freedom. So it has been a while. I am not in a position to mount the counter to that counter argument, not a strong one today anyway, but I remember reading that book and at least coming away a little depressed, and a little bit worried about how strong states can be as a deterrent to federal overreach. And I would at least say that there is a reasonable good argument out there that they're not perfect antithesis to federal overreach. I think maybe I answered your question somewhere in there.
Okay, yep. So let's see. Yeah, you answered that question too. So yeah, so that's really the federalism argument. As far as the tyranny of the majority, that was a phrase that was thrown around a lot during the founders' time. That goes way back into classical political philosophy, the tyranny of the majority. So yeah, you believe that it is still a something to be avoided today, the tyranny of the majority?
Absolutely. In fact, this probably touches on the core arguments that convinced me that direct election of senators was such a terrible idea. You alluded to some of these ideas earlier. You were summarizing my arguments. When I set out to write this paper, there were already a lot of really good arguments. What I meant to say was really good writings on the subject of how federalism could be preserved through state legislatures electing senators. And so I kind of tried to let that just be in the background as I wrote. I remember in particular, there's some really good articles by Todd Zawicki, who's a law professor. He was at George Mason at the time. I'm not sure if he's still there. Somewhere in here, I have a footnote where I try to cite all of those because there are a lot of really smart people who've written on that subject. What I didn't think had been treated as well, and what probably ended up being more persuasive to me, was this concept of dividing Congress into two houses, which immediately makes it somewhat more difficult to pass legislation simply because you have to go through two, but then also making them as but while still having both of them ultimately represent the people, to make them as distinct as possible, so that if one house for whatever reason is in a position where it's subject to certain special interests or certain passions or biases or whatever it is, the other house is as least likely as possible to be subject to those same things. And then furthermore, to go into your this tyranny of the majority idea, the Senate in this division was supposed to be the cooler headed, a little more insulated. They didn't have to go for re-election every 2 years. They didn't answer directly to the people by vote. They answered to state legislatures, who in turn answered to the people. But they were supposed to. I mean, I think in the framers' mind, the House would be churning out bills because they were getting letters all the time from their voters, and this problem needs to be addressed. This problem. But then they'd come to the Senate and stall, not stall, but slow down. And let's take some time to think about this. And is this really what we want? Is this the right solution for such and such problem? That as a check on the tyranny of majority was I think supposed to be a very strong one. The point was protecting the rights of sometimes our most vulnerable. And we've kind of gotten to this strange place in our political dialogue where it seems like now the only place we look for protection of minorities, I mean, you ask like any common man on the street, and I feel like the answer you're going to get is the Bill of Rights, and we hope that courts will enforce the Bill of Rights. That seems to be the only place we look for protection of the minority, and that's just a perversion of the structure that they set out to design. Our Congress was supposed to be designed to pass few, if any, laws that permitted tyranny of the majority.
Yeah. Yeah, I argue that at the founding there were really two ideologies that influenced us, and that was classical liberalism and classical republicanism. And so, we've seen deterioration of classical republicanism in favor of a more predominantly classically liberal regime. And so, we focus on the ideas of Hobbes and Locke to and so I think that's what the understanding is. As you said, you talk to people on the street, and they would expect that if we want some change, then we have to have a law, and it has to be enforced by the courts, and that's what we really look forward to as far as defense of our rights and liberties. But so I'm glad you brought that up. So as far as, let's continue with the distinction of the two different houses. There still are some distinctions. The difference in the terms. What else am I forgetting here?
I mean, there are age qualifications.
Yes.
And of course, you ended up with this structure where you've got two per state, as opposed to the house districts.
Yeah. What do you think about? How do you think these are holding up today? Do they provide? I don't want you to quantify, but could you say, like, is it? Are those still good enough, or have we lost? Like how? My question is, like, how much have we lost, and how much do we still have with the distinctiveness between the two houses?
Sure. No, it's a good question. I'm not sure the age qualifications ever made much of a difference. I certainly don't see any. I don't notice any big difference that makes now. I do think the terms that 6-year versus 2-year terms seem to contribute in a way. So maybe at some point we'll get into all of the other failures that I think have led to a just bloated federal government. And so if we were to set all of those things aside, I do still like the idea that at least senators don't have to worry about re-election every 2 years, because that gives some insulation and some ability to, again, just this idea of just slowing down and being a little cooler headed about things. Somewhere in my article, as I was reviewing it, I found there was a reference to a difference between urgent legislation and necessary legislation. Sometimes those can be the same thing. Sometimes we need a law that is urgent and necessary. But sometimes things that are treated urgently, it turns out, if you kind of sit for a little bit and think about it, maybe let the moment take a minute for the moment to catch up with you, you realize you've acted too hastily. And so I think the 6-year terms is helpful with that. I get the point of almost trying to quantify how much we lost with the state with state legislatures electing their senators. I mean, I think it's a real, we lost something. How much, I guess I can't say for sure. But yeah, just the idea of making the two bodies as different as possible was, they were the founders were so focused on that as a form of protecting people's rights. And so I know at one point you're bound to ask, do I think we should go back to it? And the answer is absolutely yes, because even if it makes not a huge difference, if it can slow down the ability of our Congress to just pass so many laws, I'm in favor of it. I'm a fan of liberty and not a fan of just government legislating everything.
Do you have any other ideas about options today? As well, I guess this was before we were recording, but I said it's not a very popular idea today. But
Yeah.
so do you think that there are other options to increase the distinction of the Senate or both houses other than the repeal of the 17th Amendment?
I haven't given that as much thought. I will say this. I'm not even necessarily a proponent of this, but it's related, so I'll just mention it. I don't want to delve too much into this because it can get really complicated, but some of the framers that we think of as the Constitution's biggest proponents, that they actually weren't in favor of state legislatures electing senators, but it wasn't, and Madison will be the biggest example of what I'm getting into. It was not so much that they had an issue with it wasn't so much that they thought that diminished democratic values or something like that. Their concerns, again, this probably gets a little too complicated, but it had to do with equal versus proportional representation, and also keeping the Senate very small. And so for them, it was just the fact that they needed the Senate to be elected by larger geographic areas than at least some states comprised. And I as I was rereading my article, honestly, I was reminded about some of the numbers, even where even if you had given Rhode Island just one senator, under proportional representation, there would have been 82 senators, which is a huge amount. And then you think about so in other words, in our day, our Senate would have like 350 members or something like that. It would look like the House. So anyway, Madison, in particular, I recall, hit his proposal because he needed senators to represent something larger than a state. He proposed, it may have been an electoral system, or it may have even been direct election, but his proposal was that the senators would represent large geographic areas that comprised more than one state. And in his mind, that still led to some sort of distinction between the two because, House representatives were focused on these small districts that at most were the size of a state, but in a lot of cases were less than a state. And then a senator, on the other hand, was thinking about a much bigger geographical area. That was a way, I guess, to distinguish between the two. It didn't end up, obviously, having any traction. There was a big compromise at the Constitutional Convention, and they ultimately decided on equal state representation. But I guess I throw that out there as a thought. Again, I don't even know that I'm a proponent of it, but to the extent people are saying, okay, maybe direct election, or maybe returning to state legislature doesn't make sense, but we want to change it somehow. There's this idea that Madison had where we still want a small Senate. So what if we had these larger geographical areas for people to vote in? I don't know. That I toss that out there, I guess, as a possibility. But even as I kind of articulated it, I don't know that I am a fan of it.
Yeah, at the national level, I remember reading about that just very briefly. Not just in your article, but I think in another. I don't know, when I was studying the Constitutional Convention or something, but I don't think that was. I don't think they thought about it or even talked about it for very long. But I remember it being brought up. It didn't seem very popular. But
John, I'm sorry. You saying that does remind me. And this one I also am not a proponent of, but in the initial Virginia plan that Madison he actually kind of put together before the convention started. The initial proposal was for the House to elect the senators.
Hmm.
Now, I think that's a terrible idea, because the whole point is to divide the House into two chambers that don't depend on each other, so that they're more likely to clash and that sort of thing. So I don't think that was a good idea at all. But it is another way to divide the two houses and pick senators in some other way. And maybe I mean, is there some way to take that idea but not have state legislatures vote? I guess I don't know. But anyway, that was another proposal for how to structure it.
Yeah, yeah, that would still provide a distinction between
It would
the
be a
houses,
distinction.
an indirect election, but but still, yeah, I don't think I would be in favor of that.
No.
You because I just talked to a New Hampshire politician before this interview, and so now you got me thinking. Yeah, I mean, well, I guess New Hampshire does use something like that on the state level,
Okay.
because they have different districts for their House and Senate, and they have a very large house of 400, I believe, and a very small Senate, and the districts seem to have nothing to do with one another. Whereas most states, let me add that their Senate is like 24, so that's very small.
That is, yeah.
And but most states, and particularly here in Idaho, we have an issue, and maybe I should bring this up to the state legislators, but they've been I guess they've been badgered by some people in very large counties, but small populated, with very small populate, very rural counties that don't seem to they don't get a very good say in the legislature, because our legislature, we have districts, and they're all equal by mostly equal by population, and so you have like 3 counties that are all one district, and then over here in the over there in the Boise area, you have several you have like 20 districts just in a very in one county. So
Okay.
yeah, so there's issues there, but I mean, maybe if we did something like that on the state level, where you disconnected, because in our districts we have one senator and then seat A and B for the House, and so on the ballot every 2 years we have and they're not even different in their terms. So yeah, just their number, their numbers in the House. So that's really the only distinction between them. And it does provide, I think it does provide a distinction, but we could use more, I think.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the more distinctions, the better. Yeah.
Would you be in favor at the federal level of expanding the House? I mean, enlarging the House so they had more districts, and so they were smaller and so had a better connection with their populations.
Oh, I will admit to having not thought about it carefully. But maybe so. I think I might be. In part because this description you've given of, was it New Hampshire?
Yeah.
It is an interesting point to have, such a large body on the one hand as opposed to such a small body on the other. It seems like at some point it probably becomes unmanageable, but I don't think we've neared that point yet. I think I would be I'd be in favor of, I guess, if there were a way to test it out. And maybe some of our states have, we've kind of on a small scale. New Hampshire has sort of tested that out. It might be interesting to see how that compares maybe to a state where you've got houses that are more similar in number and not quite so many represent. I think I'm definitely open to thinking about that idea. I suppose not opposed to it on any. I can't think of any principled reason to oppose it. For me, it's almost a question of empirics.
Do you have anything else to say on distinction? I want to move on to the Electoral College next, but if you have anything else to say on the distinction of the Senate or the two houses.
Maybe I'll say two things that are totally unrelated to one another. One is it's kind of funny. We are, you and I clearly, and others are proponents of the idea of two houses. But what's kind of funny is the tradition that we've inherited this from had a very obvious reason for dividing into two houses, and that was in Parliament there was the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and so there were literally, at least from their view of society, different interests to represent, and so it became very natural to have these two interests represented as two houses, and so some of the struggle we have, I think, to design two distinct houses is that at bottom, if we kind of ask each other, like, who does the House ultimately represent and who does the Senate ultimately represent? In my view, at least, if we've designed them correctly, it is the people. It's ultimately the people. And so we don't have right, because we don't have lords, we don't have commons, and so ultimately we actually do want them both to trace back to the people. The idea is that if we make them distinct, if we slow down one process, that the end of the legislative process kind of represents the best of ourselves, the best of what those people want. But anyway, so it can make it feel a little bit artificial to design what these two houses look like, because we are, I think, starting from the same base. Whereas in that historical model that we inherited and tried to use for ourselves, at least from their point of view, they actually did have two different interests represented in that house, if that makes sense. The second point I wanted to make, although maybe it is kind of related, is when it comes to the federalism and the state interest side, one thing that I want to clarify for myself, at least, and this really kind of hit home as I wrote this long ago, is there was a point in my life where I kind of was convinced of the idea of states having representation in Congress for their own sake as states, like the states' rights term that's thrown around in certain circles, and somewhere along the way realized what I would consider to be the error of that argument, in that states have no rights as some sort of abstract thing. Even in that case, even there, when we talk about states, it's really the people who are within that state. They're the ones that I'm concerned about in terms of liberty and their rights and being able to make a living and all those things. And so that division too between federal and state, it should never be about the interest of states as states. That's not even a real thing. It's just yet another way to divide the power, put in these checks and balances, the separation of powers, in a way so that whatever comes out on the other end of that legislative process or that government process is something that's been considered, that it's been thought through, and hopefully is something that protects the rights of the people.
Okay, let me follow up with a question.
Sure.
William Borah was very well at the time. He was a very famous Idaho senator. He's famous even today for keeping us out of the League of Nations. but at the time, originally he was elected by the state legislature, but he was in favor of the popular election because his argument was that the Senate had become the place for special interests in so say you have like an industry that is just really big in that state. The argument was that their interests were the most prevalent, that were funneling up through the state legislature to the Senate. So you would have, I guess in Idaho, it would be like at the time forestry and mining. Those were the big industries, and so that's all that you really saw being represented by the senators at that time. What do you think about that argument about how the 17th Amendment would dampen the special interests and be more of a broader representation of the people of the whole state rather than just specific industries?
My response, I think, is a really cynical one, which would be the solution he is proposing is like pouring gasoline on that fire. I think direct election of senators would only make those problems worse. And to really indulge my cynicism, that may have very well been part of his motivation. I do not know this. I will admit to not knowing the senator you're referring to. If he voted against the League of Nations, and hopefully he had some principles. But I think direct election of senators only made it easier for special interests to capture the Senate. I just, yeah. So I'm sorry to hear that was a problem. That is a problem of government everywhere. The idea of narrower moneyed interest being able to have an outsized influence when it comes to what representatives are hearing and their understanding of what people want. But in my view, direct election of senators is the worst possible way to have dealt with that. You may have mentioned this earlier, one of the papers I cited a couple times in here, I did not go back and reread it recently, I will admit, but it's by Professor Todd Zawicki, who was then of George Mason. I'm not sure if he still teaches there or not. He's a really smart law professor that I had the privilege of hearing speak a number of times. He wrote one of his articles in favor of repealing the 17th Amendment. It's something about, let me see, I think I actually have the title here. Public choice. Well, actually, I don't have the whole title, but it refers to public choice theory. And his whole argument that he tries to lay out empirically is that as soon as we switched to direct election, it became easier for these special interests to capture senators, not harder. That would be my response to that senator's point.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go on to the Electoral College. What are your thoughts on the Electoral College, and should we go back to the method of choosing our electors, which originally was the state legislatures electing them?
Yes, yes. Although I guess to respond to kind of your last point, it is unfortunate that the changes in kind of the way our electoral college functions, which to put a finer point on it, is that in all but 2 states, if I am correct, the popular vote in that state, simply all the electoral votes go to that winning candidate. It is state legislatures who chose that system, unfortunately. So I suppose I have to credit that point that having state legislatures choose the electors, so to say, apparently they chose to abdicate that. But do I think that the initial structure made more sense than what we have today? Yes. And it some of the arguments are similar and some are different. They're different in the sense that um, the output of the electoral process is, a unitary executive, and so they're different in the sense that we're not talking about making two houses of a legislative body distinct, but they are again similar in the sense of putting some filters between the people and the elected representative. Um, and I just think that ultimately benefits the people. We talked about tyranny of the majority earlier, and the idea of urgency and kind of the passions of the moment. I like the idea of having some insulation so that those passions can't result so quickly in laws that we end up with laws that that diminish the liberties of the people. Now, we are talking about an executive, and so to be clear as well, an executive doesn't, thankfully, well, debatably, make laws in our society. I say debatably because
Yeah.
we could talk about the administrative state and other things for a long time.
Yeah.
But I also would want to make the point, of course, that there are certain things the executive does where we do want them to be able to act much more quickly, but those aren't in the realm of legislation in my view. Those are in the realm of things like foreign relations or wars or things
Yeah.
like that. I like that the executive can act quickly in some of those situations. I think that's necessary. But yeah, I'm a fan of the Electoral College, even in its current watered down state. I would keep it. I am not a fan of these movements. I think a number of states now have ratified or whatever this proposal where we'd go to a majority vote. I am not a fan. I like what I love about the Electoral College, and again, even in its current state where it doesn't function quite the way it was supposed to, is that I think it forces a presidential candidate to try to appeal to a broader swath of interest in our country. I think switching to a popular vote, it would very quickly become like California and New York deciding every president. And they just don't. I've lived in one of those states. I lived in New York for several years and by it for many years more, and I worked in it for those later years. I love the people in New York and loved working with them, but they don't represent the views of everyone across this country. And I think our electoral college, even now with having changed as it has, I think it does some service to the idea of resulting in a president who has to respect those interests across the country and not just worry about elites on our coast.
Okay. All right. That's all I got for you. Do you have any last words? Oh, I don't think I mentioned that you're currently a litigator with Krenfell Sumter in Raleigh. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
We will definitely get that plug in.
No, that's fine. I last thoughts. I mean, what I did note down some things, which is I am absolutely a proponent of repealing the 17th Amendment. I think that would only work towards the good. But I am also saddened by how many other elements of the structure that the founders put in place have just been eroded over time. I'm a lawyer, so I spend a lot of time in court and thinking about courts. And I think I think the Supreme Court a long time ago abdicated its responsibility to enforce some of these things. What we talk about in, I guess, conservative lawyer circles is the Commerce Clause has been expanded to the point where Congress can legislate in any area it wants without any sort of check. And I just think that's a gross perversion of the enumerated powers that it was supposed to be exercising. And I alluded to earlier, we definitely don't have to get into it here, but the rise of the administrative state, where you've basically got all three branches of government working to, in the hands of people. And the whole point was to separate these things. And we've got a fourth branch of government that exercises all three powers. Anyway, there are a lot of components to the result we have today. And I hope for a time when we can kind of move back to some of these classical principles that you've talked about. I just think the result would be so much better for the people of this country and for our freedoms and our liberty. I believe in people. I don't believe in government.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you doing this. And
Sure.
Well, you have a good day.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.